How do you see the role of infrastructure development post the COVID pandemic era?
Well, infrastructure is the key to social and economic development.
Yeah.
I mean, as much as I like standing on a construction site watching diggers dig and bulldozers push dirt and rock, it's not pouring concrete and building the infrastructure that we do it for. We do it to deliver services to people, whether it's water, electricity, or your transportation services. So post-COVID, we need to think about, well, what are all the things that didn't get done during COVID? There were a lot of delays to projects. What are all the projects and schemes?
There were a lot of shovel-ready projects that didn't actually.
That's right. What were all the schemes that people said were shovel-ready that they put on a list and then funded that still didn't get built because the basic things you need to have before you start building, like designations, planning permission, consents, detailed designs, and then issuing design for construction. If those things aren't ready, then your project wasn't shovel ready. But unfortunately, the previous government didn't understand that. And so they've actually left us in a much worse position, having borrowed an additional $100 billion, which my children and other people's children, potentially grandchildren, will be paying back. They've delivered next to no infrastructure.
You say $100 billion?
$100 billion. When the previous government took over, New Zealand had a government debt of 50 billion, and now it's 150 billion. And no one driving around New Zealand, going to work, or going on holiday would be able to say, hey, I'm driving on better roads, or if you live in Wellington, it's like, oh, they fixed all the water leaks. There are some things that did progress, but most of them were long-term projects that had already been funded under the previous government, like the Puhoi to Warkworth State Highway 1. Fantastic piece of infrastructure. But it takes years to stand up projects like that. It can take typically 6 years from agreeing to proceed with a project, going through, completing the business case, completing the financial and commercial case, design, and then starting construction. So to get to the construction start line is typically 6 years for a major project. So where are we post-COVID? Well, we've had 6 wasted years where the previous government cancelled major roading projects, spent a lot of effort trying to stand up Auckland Light Rail, Let's Get Wellington Moving, other what you might say are transformational transport and urban development projects. They didn't proceed because they didn't understand what it takes to get them to the start line, and they also hadn't necessarily diagnosed the problem and come up with the right solution. So we have to do that now. We have to actually go back and look at the work the Infrastructure Commission has done. So where is the need? Well, clearly we've got a need for water infrastructure. A huge infrastructure deficit is built up there. Transportation infrastructure in our major cities and between our metros like Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga. And then there's other things like ports, for example, our education, our health infrastructure, which need to become much more efficient in order to deliver the services that we need them to.
So I'm a planner. Past is past, right? Can't do anything about what's happened in the last 3 years. What have you got planned for us, which is different? And how are you going to influence positive change in the infrastructure sector in New Zealand?
Well, I know you're asking me personally. I've got plans, but I'll just tell you a little bit about what the government's plans are, because I'm also what you might call a junior cabinet minister in the current national.
You're still the member of Parliament,
New Zealand First and ACT coalition.
Yeah.
And so what the government's planning to do is to stand up the roads of national significance, about 15 major roading projects, many of which were cancelled by the previous government. We've got to get those underway as quickly as possible. And that's basically to deliver safer, more efficient roads so people can get to work, freight can get around the country. And then we've got to look at the water reforms. I mean, the previous government's attempt at it was an absolute disaster. They had confused a number of problems. So we all agree it's a three waters problem, that a lot of councils haven't invested in infrastructure, they haven't invested in renewals and maintenance. Now we've got leaks springing up everywhere, people's water isn't safe to drink, you've got wastewater in the harbour. None of those problems were solved for the billions that they spent. So we need to solve that, and really the problem to solve there is a funding and financing issue. How do we generate the money, produce the money to fix the pipe network, for example, and then who pays for it and over what timeframes. So my role in solving some of these problems, I have been delegated by the Minister for Infrastructure, Honourable Chris Bishop, the role to investigate the policy tools for funding and financing. So considering things like value capture. If we're going to build a transformational urban development and transport project, then there's going to be an uplift in land value around that project.
Absolutely.
And currently we don't have a system to capture some of that uplift and return it to pay for the project. All of that gets captured by the private landowners, even though they get the benefits of having infrastructure. So I'll be looking at funding and financing and how we can stand up some better options so that a lot of these projects which are currently unfunded can proceed and as quickly as possible. And I'll be looking at resource management reform, how we make it easier to get consents. And in fact, in an ideal world, most of the stuff we do in construction we wouldn't need consents for because we already know how to manage the environmental effects, and that's the approach I'll be taking.
Interesting. Those are quite interesting insights. And